This was easily the best of the four cross-examination rounds in the recent debate on Romans chapter 9. James White shifts the conversation back to the most crucial context of Romans 9 after just having wasted A.K. Richardson's entire last round, being forced to refute libertarian free will for no reason. A.K. knows what's coming, and the way he breaks the fourth wall in annoyance is hilarious.
All right. So let's go back to where we were, and we sort of just touched on it now, but I think it's extremely important. It sounded to me at the end of the last cross-examination that you were positing some type of a distinction or a difference, but let me point your attention to it again. Romans 8:30, those whom he predestined, these he also called. And those whom he called, these he also justified. And those whom he justified, these he also glorified. So, first of all, you would agree with me that justified is very clearly a soteriological term that refers to a person who has been made right with God.
I believe this is a soteriological verse.
Yes, okay.
It's important to recall what James is referring back to here. Here's a clip from the previous cross-examination.
Okay, let's get into the text in the last 2 minutes here. Would you admit that verses 23 and 24, in order that he might make known the riches of his glory upon vessels of mercy, which he prepared beforehand for glory, even us whom he also called, not from among Jews only, but also from among Gentiles. Is this not soteriological language?
Yes.
Okay, so mercy and choosing even us whom he also called. So were the vessels of destruction prepared for destruction? I'm sorry, vessels of wrath prepared for destruction, verse 22. Were they called in the same way that the vessels of mercy were?
You might have to define what you mean by called.
The conversation got off track because AK misunderstood what James was asking. But now, with a full 10 minutes on the clock, Dr. White approaches this concept from the opposite side of the text in question. Remember that the book of Romans is a letter. In other words, it's an intentional, continuous stream of thought from a writer to an audience. There are times where Paul changes subjects slightly in the letter, but the chapter breaks between the content of Romans 8 and Romans 9 is not one of those places. And the foundation of these two questions is how you can know. So what is that foundation? Let me break it down for you. Romans 9:23 and Romans 8:30 are both contextually and structurally linked. Romans 9:23 is the close of an explanation of something that was revealed in Romans 8:30. This is what's known as the golden chain of redemption. It starts with God foreknowing, predestining, calling, justifying, and glorifying people who are slaves of sin, made into slaves of God, a context built by the last two chapters, 6 and 7. After giving this chain of redemption, Paul goes on to explain and defend God's purposes and his right to have this kind of election. He wraps it up in verse 23 of Romans 9 by calling back to what he said in chapter 8, verse 30, a process which is performed by God, which ultimately results in glorification. He says he endures with long-suffering vessels of wrath prepared for destruction, that he might make known the riches of his glory on the vessels of mercy, which he had prepared beforehand for glory. This is the same glory from the golden chain of redemption in Romans 8:30, both explicitly describing a process of God preparing a chosen vessel for glory. Why it's important for AK to affirm that justification and glorification is soteriological is because if it is, what else other than this chain of redemption is necessary for salvation? Justification before God is the element that salvation hinges on. The ultimate question that this conclusion begs is, okay, so how are we justified? And AK knows that. Watch the exchange.
Would you believe that anything other than faith is required for justification?
I assume you mean as a responsibility of man, because the atonement was required,
Well, yeah, right. No, on the part of the man, yes.
faith is you're justified by faith. That's right.
And not by anything else.
I know where you're going, Dr. White. See,
So is everybody else in the room.
yeah. So, well, if you want to talk about it, we can.
No, I'm not trying. Look, if you're not comfortable talking about it, I'm just trying to point out that justification here, those who are justified are glorified. So there's not a bunch of room in there to insert a whole lot else.
What he's saying is that if those who are justified were predestined, and all of that is God preparing them for glory from Romans 9:23, then what else is faith other than part of God's preparing for glorification, as suggested by Ephesians 2, when faith is stated to be a gift from God? And yes, Romans 4 says we are justified through faith. Hebrews 11 lists faith as the evidence of justification, not the prerequisite. The atonement is the prerequisite.
Well, I said that because it suddenly dawned on me what you were asking. You're talking about baptism, right? Well, if you want to have
that would depend on where you're coming from, my friend.
So we could talk about it if you like. So it's not exactly Romans 9, but
No, I want to actually get into Romans. I'm not trying to drag it off there. I'm just simply saying if I believe Romans 8:30 is very much part of the context of Romans 9. So I'm not trying to get at Romans 9, and I want to get into Romans 9 and the calling. But those whom he called, he also justified. Those whom he justified, these he also glorified. Those are all God's actions: justification, glorification. So the calling of Romans 8:30, do you see that as being different than the calling of verse 24 in chapter 9? Even us, whom he called, not only from Jews, but also from Gentiles.
I do not see the calling differently in Romans 9:24.
Okay, so it's the same calling, and it results in justification.
Well, okay. I believe it results in justification if you respond to the call.
Okay, so
through faith.
So do you?
Even he had to catch himself adding works. But it doesn't matter if he adds through faith, of course, because you've already made responding the hinge that salvation turns on, rather than the faith itself, which caused you to respond in the first place. So he's not justified through faith. He's justified through responding once he has faith. The faith itself, given by God, is nothing in his system. In this next question, James draws attention to the most important distinction between Calvinists and non-Calvinists. Non-Calvinists like A.K. Richardson and Leighton Flowers make the gospel call that is going out to the world through God's servants synonymous with the call of God, which is mentioned in this golden chain and at the end of Romans 9. But the calling here always results in justification. And the gospel message, when preached, only results in justification sometimes, because not everyone believes it. A.K. Richardson cannot answer the question using the text.
So, do you see a difference between what Reformed theologians call the general call, which is through the preaching of the gospel, which goes out to everybody? Because I don't know who the elect are. So, I'll go up to Salt Lake City and I'll proclaim the gospel to everybody walking by. I don't know who the elect are. That's up to God. But then the specific call of Romans 8:30 results in justification. Are you saying that it doesn't always result in, because it says those whom he called? Are you saying there are those whom he called that are not justified?
Well, though I'm not saying you can't tell from that verse whether there would be or not. So if you're asking me my general belief, yes, many are called, few are chosen. He calls through the gospel, and yes, I understand a distinction. Now, you have Reformed theologians have a mysterious work of the Spirit that I don't believe in. I don't believe it's mysterious. The Spirit works through the gospel. So in this verse, it just says, whom he calls, he justifies, and I couldn't prove other distinctives of my theology from that.
Okay. And those whom he foreknew, these he also called. Were there people he foreknew that he didn't call?
Well, I believe whom he foreknows the church, his people, and no, there ain't anybody that's his people that he didn't call.
So
he called them through the gospel.
So the audience remains the same. We probably disagree on what foreknew meant.
Why would they disagree on what foreknew means in Romans 8:29? Because the non-Calvinist reads, "And we know that all things work together for good to those who chose to love God, to those who are called according to his purpose, because God knew who would make that righteous choice to love God. He also predestined to give them more choices that may or may not conform them into the image of Christ, but it will result in justification, but only because God knew that they would make the right choice, not because he planned it to be that way." The Calvinist looks at the text objectively and sees that foreknew is an active verb. Though it's in a different language, it's being used the same way that knew is used in Genesis 4:1. Adam knew his wife. He entered into her and bore a new creation in her. God foreknows us, enters into us in the Spirit, and bears a new creation in us, which is called being born again by the Spirit of the living God.
But the audience remains the same. So those whom he foreknew, these he also called. They're the same group. But then it sounds like you just said, and those whom he called, these he also justified. But you said that there are those who called who will not be justified. So you have a different group.
No, see, in this verse, I believe he's talking about the same group. I believe he's referring to Christians. He's saying what has been done to Christians is they've been called, they've been justified, they were foreknown, and they've been predestined to be conformed. That's all the same group. Now, if you're asking, so then...
Well, wait a minute. So those who are justified will be glorified? Because I'm not sure... Can you be justified and lose your salvation?
Well, if you want to have this discussion, I'm up for it. It's not Romans 9. But no, so I believe that...
Well, it's Romans 8:30, though.
Well, yeah, I mean, I know, but but it's not a debate on Romans 8. I'm just saying, a lot of times, a lot of us, in these debates get criticized for not sticking to Romans 9, but I'm okay. I mean, it's all right with me.
AK is trying to draw attention away from the fact that Romans 8:30 is clear context for all of Romans 9, since this is a letter and Romans 9 is just a few strokes of a pen away. AK just spent his whole last cross-examination round defending libertarian free will for no reason. I guess he wants to do it again because he wants nothing to do with where the concept of Romans 9 began. Now he just makes up a random story off the top of his head and expects you to believe it.
So do I believe you could be justified? And in other words, you're talking about losing salvation. No, I believe that, I believe what Paul is doing in Romans 8 is these Christians are very worried because, they don't have the full New Testament. And there's a lot of things happening to them. Death, they're being persecuted, all kinds of things. And they're worried that this means they're going to be defeated, that if the enemy is defeating them. After all, hey, if the people we love are killed, does that mean they're not going to be in heaven or resurrected? And Paul's saying, no, here's the full thing that God does. He doesn't do one thing and then leave it. If you're justified, he's also going to glorify you. That's the ending one. He's saying God has an entire purpose, and death is not going to separate you.
Okay, but the context here, and this is what ties into Romans 9, that's why I think it's completely relevant, is he's talking about those who are the called according to his purpose.
Yes.
You said Christians. So does his purpose determine who he calls, or do our actions determine who he calls?
Well, I think you're using determine. When you say determine, if you just mean if our actions are contingent, or if being saved or justified is conditional, I believe that's the case. But that's different than when I talk about God determining things, because we're talking a philosophical sense of him causally determining, which I do believe Calvinism teaches. But God is sovereign, and as you conceded, you can be libertarianly free and him still be sovereign. So if he purposes to save those who freely believe, that's his prerogative. It's him determining salvation.
AK tried to make the golden chain start with justification and throw a condition in with it, which is a works-based justification, by the way. But James isn't going to let him forget how the chain began. He's going to make him define foreknown.
What does foreknowing mean in verse 29? Those whom he foreknew, he also predestined.
I would say two things. One, it definitely doesn't mean determined beforehand because it's distinguished from predestined. Well,
does it mean to know beforehand?
Well, the word itself does. Now, I generally take it here to mean to forelove.
There it is, folks. Those he foreloved, he predestined. That's the end of the debate. There's no coming back from admitting that foreknew means foreloved, and nobody is talking about it. They're all pretending like it matters that James affirmed that Adam had libertarian free will. I made a video about that, by the way, shameless plug. I'll put it up on the end screen. Watch James White bring this round to a close.
But I'm not opposed to foreknowing, just simply knowing ahead of time.
So those whom he foreloved, he also predestined. And then I think you made a comment about to be conformed to the image of his Son. Is anyone but a Christian conformed to the image of Christ?
No, absolutely not. And I believe in context it's about the resurrection.
Right. So this is all soteriological language, but basically your position is that none of this determines who's going to believe, but it is all based upon God's knowledge that they will believe?
Well, it doesn't say anything in the verse about him determining who will believe.
Okay. All right. So if that is the calling of Romans chapter 8, then in Romans chapter 9, when it specifically says that we are that he might make known the riches of his glory upon vessels of mercy, which he before ordained unto glory, who also he called us. He called us. Doesn't that demonstrate that the calling of Romans 8:30 and the calling of Romans 9:24 is not universal, and it is based upon the will of God and not the will of man?
Well, it is the will of God. Again, my position is that it is the will of God to call people through the gospel and save those who believe. So again, you keep contrasting the will of God. It's two different categories. The will of man is choosing to believe as a responsibility that God in his sovereignty has put on him. What God wills, or let me say it like this, Dr. White, what God is willing to do in salvation is different from what man wills to do. God provides the atonement. He wills to save those who believe. He lays down the conditions. Man has to accept responsibility. It's not God doing the same thing that man's doing. So I do believe this is God's will. As you conceded, God is sovereign even if man is libertarian free will or is libertarianly free. So I do believe this is God's will.
Okay, that will conclude our rounds of cross-examination.